Could you tell me what you're going to talk about and its relation to Circles of Mercy?
I can. So I thought what I would do is tell you about a project I've been involved in the East End of London for the last couple of years. And the project is called For Your Welfare and Not For Your Harm. And I want to tell you about why it got that name, because it didn't start off with that name. And the reason it ends up with that name is deeply connected to themes of Circles of Mercy and what they are. So one of the things I want to do is dispel the idea that Circles of Mercy is a kind of romantic or very naive kind of theme. I want to talk about it in the context of difficult things, of pain. So one of the things I've been doing for the last few years is reading the French social philosopher and mystic Simone Weil. And she talks about, she's writing in the mid-20th century, she talks about the deep need to pay what she calls extreme attention in the modern world. And she thinks that most of the ways that we live in the modern world pull us away from being able to attend properly, both to the material world, to the industrial workplace world, but also to each other as human beings. And she argues that one of the things we do in the face of pain and difficulty and loss is we want to pull away from those things, and so we distract ourselves endlessly by finding all sorts of ways to not pay attention to the most demanding, difficult parts of being human. So she wants us to go back, learn how to attend by disciplining ourselves to listening carefully to that which is most difficult and painful. And I kind of took this impetus from Weil and thought, well, what would it mean to try and pay attention in the context of the kind of work that Catholic faith-based organisations are doing with some of the people who face the most difficult circumstances imaginable. Now, the final bit of Weil that I wanted to mention at this point is she talks about the way in which, if you want to communicate the love and the justice that the gospel speaks of, you have to first look loss and difficulty in the face. The only route to the proclamation of the depth of the gospel's message of love and justice is to look difficulty in the face first. So I took that challenge into the work that I was doing with the Jesuit Refugee Service in Wapping in the East End of London. And the kind of questions I wanted to ask were questions about how people sought the good life in the context that they were living in. Now, the context that people were living in, just to make this very clear, I was working with a group of people, about 30 people, from a pool of about 250 who use the facilities of the Jesuit Refugee Service, a day centre, a legal advice centre, hot food that's served, prayer groups, English language groups, and friendship contexts. So people who are living in destitution in the asylum system in the UK, they've applied for refugee status and they've been refused for whatever complicated reasons, but they have no route anywhere else at the moment, and so they live for anywhere between a matter of a few months and in fact many years, including some people who've been there for over a decade. They live dependent on charitable handouts, they live sofa surfing, so dependent either on very generous friends or more abusive individuals who will extract childcare or sexual labour in return for accommodation. Many also live, as I discovered, on night buses travelling around the centre of London, so changing every few hours, choosing routes that are more or less safe, and particularly for women, a night bus is actually a safer place than living on the streets. Now, as I began to listen to the experiences of people who had been living in these contexts and to discover what made for them the good life, the goods that they wanted to pursue, and how together they could form communities of mutual support, circles of mercy for each other, the words of Pope Francis were really ringing in my ears. So you'll probably remember both his Lampedusa sermon and a couple of the other pieces that he wrote, in which he talks about the way in which our modern societies drive us to be faceless, nameless individuals, and that the logic of Christianity is to become people with faces and with names. And I kept thinking about baptism and thinking about the logic of baptism, this naming, and the whole process through which Christianity and the scriptures talk to us about the significance of naming. So much of what I heard from the people I was interviewing was the way in which they were stripped of identity, stripped of personhood, stripped of dignity, and the very process of unnaming had become absolutely core to who they were. And to my total surprise, when I was interviewing someone who received complex, sophisticated legal services and support, many other forms of very practical assistance, and I said, why do you come here? What makes the difference for you? Why the Jesuit Refugee Service rather than one of the other day centres? And he said to me, when I arrive here, I'm greeted at the door by my name. Someone shakes my hand, they touch me, and they use my name. Here, the staff eat their meals alongside us. They don't take their food to eat elsewhere. And these are the things that remind me that I'm a human being. They re-dignify me in a system that strips me, that makes me anonymous and dispensable. And so that language of Francis, particularly in the Lampedusa sermon, that we are not made to be creatures who are anonymous, disposable, one person interchangeable with another, but that we're dignified, named individuals called to be responsible for each other. So the whole, where is your brother line that he uses in that Lampedusa sermon, drawing on Cain and Abel, that becomes for me the context in which calling back to life through the creation of fellowship. That's what I saw happening at the Jesuit Refugee Service. Now, what was interesting to me is it wasn't simply a context in which we were thinking about worthy recipients of care, but rather what distinguishes JRS and what I think creates a real circle of mercy is the active involvement of refugees in supporting other refugees. This is not something done to other people. It's a process of learning how to be with others rather than doing to or for. So again, one of the most significant ways in which people talked about the creation of this circle of mercy was that they themselves were given roles, that their skills were honoured. They were remembered as people with capabilities who contributed towards the building of community rather than being passive recipients of it. And what people found difficult was not just systems that anonymised them or brutalised them through the Home Office, but other charities who failed to see them as communicating, participating, fellowship, communion building people. And so people would reminisce about the importance of their communities where they'd come from, and they wanted to rebuild those in really important ways in what they were doing. Now, the final thing that I found really interesting and striking was people's discussion of their faith lives. Now, I was really careful in the interviews not to ask anybody a question about their religious or faith identity or denomination, because that would be prejudicial. But within 5 or 6 minutes of beginning the interviews, because I was talking about where does hope come from, what's enabled you to survive in this system, what's made you a resilient person, or what's been most difficult, people would talk about religious identity and faith sources. And people would say to me, I clung to a small number of psalms. I felt like I'd walked through the valley with the shadow of death, but God was with me. Both of those things were true. I'd seen death, I'd looked it in the face, but I knew I wasn't alone. Others talked about the importance of believing there was a justice that wasn't visible to them now, but was held somehow in store for them, that there was a promise. Now, the thing that was most striking to me was that a whole series of people who had had no reason to talk to each other or share information in this way all picked the same scripture passage. When I said to people, well, that's interesting you talk about faith, so what part of the scriptures maybe has been resonant for you? And the passage that people came back and back to again and again was from Jeremiah 29, from the letter to the exiles, and it was exactly the same text. And the text is, there is a plan. God has a plan for you, a plan for your welfare and not for your harm, for a future with hope. And that single passage, that refrain came back again and again and again. And I found it so striking that people would choose to focus on that passage. So I named the report that I wrote on the process, For Your Welfare and Not for Your Harm. And as I was thinking in preparation for thinking about this wider mercy process, I thought, no, I think this is the key. I think this is what JRS did in order to create a circle of mercy as a resistance to these forces externally that were so undignified and so brutalising. And they knew that they had not only to campaign, to speak out, to advocate and to denounce, but rather to practice into being, in the most ordinary ways imaginable, an alternative logic, a structure of the kingdom. They had to prove to people in tangible, non-verbal forms very often that indeed the witness of the Christian community is to create communities that show that there is a plan for our welfare and not for our harm.